All right, welcome to the second webinar in the UIA Animal Law Commission series on international comparative law focused on animals used in industrial animal agriculture. I'm Jamie McLaughlin, your moderator today, and the Vice President of the UIA Animal Law Commission Working Group. Our panelists today include Amy Wilson, covering South Africa, Lorna Munoz, covering Bolivia, and Hira Jaleel, who's going to be covering Pakistan today. The format of our program consists of three 20-minute presentations, followed by a 30-minute roundtable discussion between the panelists. The panelists will not be taking questions during the roundtable from the audience. If you have questions today, email them to uiaanimallaw@gmail.com, and we will pass them to the presenters after the webinar. So our first panelist is Amy Wilson. Amy is a licensed attorney of the High Court of South Africa and researcher for over 13 years with professional legal experience. She's the co-founder and director of Animal Law Reform South Africa, the first animal law dedicated nonprofit in that country. She's a lecturer and research associate with the University of Johannesburg and a senior adjunct lecturer with the University of Western Cape. Amy is an independent expert with the United Nations in Harmony with Nature program and a founding steering committee member of the Global Alliance for the Rights of Nature Africa Hub. She holds bachelor's degrees in business management and law, a master's degree in animal law, and is currently working towards her doctorate. Welcome, Amy, and you can begin your presentation.
Great, thanks so much. And thank you so much for inviting me. I'm very grateful to be here. Just going to get the screen sharing. Hopefully my screen is working. Great.
Looks perfect.
Great, thank you so much. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about some of the farmed animal advocacy work that we've been doing in South Africa, predominantly through Animal Law Reform South Africa, and how we've been using law and policy to hold government and industry accountable and to affect systemic change for animals, but also humans and the planet. So I've got quite a lot that I want to cover because it is a very complex issue and it has lots of different considerations. So I'm going to spend some time laying foundations, some of the legal framework, and some of the opportunities that we have to change the status quo and some of the work we've been doing. So it is limited in terms of what I can cover in terms of time. So I'm going to go quite quickly, but as Jamie mentioned, I'm happy to answer further questions or expand on anything. Just to give context, because we're talking about animals who are farmed, and predominantly we think of animals farmed in the food context, looking at Africa as a continent, it's one of the most severe in terms of food insecurity as compared with the other continents. So that obviously comes into consideration when the South African government is looking at laws and policies. And just to give a broad context, South Africa has around 60 million people. We have some of the highest meat consumption, not only on the continent of Africa, but even globally in terms of, for example, poultry. And then similarly, we also have massive food insecurity. About a third of the population are at risk of hunger, and about 45% of the population have moderate to severe food insecurity. So again, this context is very important in terms of the goals of government and looking at who is farmed for food. Just to give a sense of the scale, over 1 billion land animals are farmed for food in the country every year. And this, by the vast majority, includes chickens, which is nearly 1 billion on their own. And then much lower in terms of numbers are pigs, cattle, and sheep. And I want to point out that this number doesn't include any aquatic animals, even though aquaculture is an industry that is actively being promoted by the government. It doesn't include insects or invertebrates. It doesn't include other wild animals and other farmed animals, because there's a tremendous number of those as well. Also in South Africa, farmed animals don't only look like that, they look like this too, right? We have a massive ostrich farming industry. We also farm rhinos and lions and various other game animals, as they're called, including our national animal, the springbok. And they are farmed for a variety of purposes, similarly also for food, but also for decorations, etc., and their meat and bones and skin. Okay, so that context is also important because they kind of straddle this line between wild, domesticated, and farmed animals. Other important contextual considerations are, obviously, it's complex in every country to advocate for animals and particularly farmed animals, but in the South African context, we have some unique things that make it extremely difficult. So I'll touch on the first three just briefly in the next slides, but I also think it's important to note that, for example, in the context of climate change, South Africa is going to be disproportionately impacted We also have a major energy crisis where the power is shut off for hours every single day, which of course shuts down farming operations and has also led to the killing, the mass killing in some cases of animals. And then we've got various kind of corruption in the context. There's a lot of poverty and various other issues. So I'm not going to go into all of them, but you can start to see the complexity. I do want to touch on culture as an important aspect. A couple of days ago in South Africa was our National Heritage Day, a public holiday, which is meant to signify the appreciation for the huge diversity we have in our country, right? Especially against the context of the abhorrent system of apartheid. However, the Heritage Day has now become synonymous with the braai. And for those that aren't familiar, it's equivalent to the American barbecue. And this was a very concerted effort by the meat industry to link those two things together, so much so now that it's become an inherent part of people's identity to be able to braai on Heritage Day. And you can see there on the slide, I braai, therefore I am South African. So that represents a massive barrier for us to overcome. Another massive barrier is the vast inequality. South Africa has been consistently ranked as the most unequal country in the world by the World Bank. So we have obviously extreme poverty and then extreme wealth. This picture for me represents a very important context that was sent to me by one of the organizations we work with in South Africa. They were going to rescue the pigs out of this situation. But as you can see, there are humans that are also living in this extreme poverty, right? They don't have access to proper sanitation and other proper services. So going into a context like that and trying to advocate for the well-being of the animal when people are so severely disparate, then it's very hard, especially going in and trying to tell people to go vegan, right? In that context is really not possible. Then again, this vast contrast we see is Africa's richest square mile that exists in Sandton in Johannesburg. And in fact, that was the law firm that I used to work at when I was a corporate lawyer. So those two things for me really represent this inequality and are very important in the discussion. Another context I want to point out is the severe gender issues we have, including gender-based violence. South Africa has some of the highest rape rates in the entire world, as well as some of the highest femicide rates. Okay, and you can see statistically an average of about 9 women are murdered every day, according to the South African Police Services. In contrast to that, and we know there's been a lot of work done in the farmed animal context of the consumption of bodies of women and of animals, and Carol Adams, etc., have done that kind of work. We have one of the top fast food producers, Nando's, having adverts like this in the public domain, which are obviously very problematic, but contribute to these kind of ideas of women's bodies for consumption and this objectification. The final thing I think is important to point out in the context is that as at today's current day, South Africa is experiencing a massive avian flu outbreak, and this has led to a huge egg shortage. So people actually are not able to buy eggs because so many animals have had to be killed, or culled as they call it, to stop the spread of this disease, which is the biggest so far. So this is happening right now. It's very important, and for me it really shows this interconnection between human and animal interest in the context of South Africa, and also against the context of the government promoting the South African Master Poultry Plan, which I'll touch on in a second. Also, South Africa contextually in Africa is important for a number of reasons, and I won't go into all of them, but essentially it has a lot of headquarters of multinationals. So what happens in the country and the laws and policies that govern them have implications for other countries. We also export to those countries. And then, of course, within our trading blocks, decision-making can impact exports. Okay, but Africa is a big continent, so South Africa is not Africa. We also see a movement of global north countries progressively coming into Africa and South Africa, either because there's less regulation, they can get away with a lot more things they can't in their respective countries, they're trying to externalize some of the severe harms that come with industrial animal agriculture, or various other reasons, right? So we see the shift from global north to global south for these harmful implications. So that's another context that's very important. let's take a look at the regulatory regime or the governance. In my mind, it's become important to try and separate what this looks like because there's so many laws that impact animals and farmed animals. So at the core of it is our constitution, which is the supreme law. But then in that context of the governance, there's animal-centric type legislation, there's environmental-centric legislation, and then human or anthrocentric. So of course, all legislation is anthropocentric, it's human-centered, but there are some laws that fit better into, for example, animal cruelty laws, which I'll touch on into the first category. Another important thing is the mandates that the governments have. So the predominant one I'm going to talk about is, you'll see there's a few on the slide there, but the Department of Agriculture, Land Reform and Rural Development is the one that's in charge of increasing agricultural production and food security, while simultaneously having the mandate for animal welfare. So clearly there's a conflict of interest when we understand what industrialized animal agriculture looks like as against animal interests. So there's kind of this regulatory capture that is happening. It means that they've failed to regulate a lot of animal issues that they otherwise should have over the years that they've had this mandate. They haven't set positive legal standards in terms of welfare for animals. And this has now led to a proliferation of soft law, where we start to see industry taking up that and regulating themselves. It's not proper regulation, it's voluntary, it's unenforceable, and it's very much slanted towards industry interests, right? So that's kind of the framework and the landscape that exists. There's not positive legal standards that we can really use to enforce in terms of welfare. So there's also this kind of industry capture that we see existing in this regulatory context. And because of these mandates, we see the government supporting and promoting these kind of heavy industrialized practices through the Poultry Master Plan, which, as the name suggests, is about promoting the poultry industry and egg industry, also promoting the game meat industry very heavily, including our exports, trying to make South Africa a world leader, trying to promote the aquacultural industry through the Aquaculture Development Bill, granting subsidies and support for industrial animal agriculture, and then other efforts like the live export guidelines. But very much the strong industry influence coming through. On the converse side of that, they are taking harmful actions towards alternatives, including plant-based and cell-based foods, where they have these burger bans and not being allowed to call non-meaty foods meaty names, right? And that happened last year, where they were actually trying to seize those products. So taking a step back now and looking at some of this animal-centric legislation, the predominant legislation is the Animals Protection Act from about 60 years ago, when South Africa was gaining its independence from the UK, which is obviously a very long time ago. Society's changed a lot since then. And while farmed animals are actually included in the definition of animal, unlike other countries like US, and there's an extremely broad list of offenses or crimes that can be done against animals, so it's a criminal statute. This is not being effectively utilized. So in theory, these could and should be used to protect animals from the vast harms that are being done to them in extremely cruel cases such as battery cages, sow stalls, gill crates, etc. But this law is very rarely used, and I'll give some statistics on prosecution in a moment. There's also no specific bans other than for things like animal fighting, dog fighting, etc. So largely this is ineffective, the animal-centric legislation at protecting the interests of farmed animals, even though it could theoretically be used. The enforcement has largely been left up to a statutory body called the NSPCA, the National Society for the Council of Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, so it's a mouthful, or the localized SPCAs, which operate on a regional basis. They are also a non-profit that receives no funding from the government, but yet they have this massive task of enforcing the animal cruelty legislation and animal welfare. They do have the power of prosecution, and generally the National Prosecuting Authority is not undertaking these. They also receive funding from the largest integrated poultry producer in South Africa, right? So because they're not receiving funding from government, they need to get it from somewhere. But I argue that that's a conflict of interest when you have them who are enforcing the animal welfare laws also being funded by some of the worst abusers. Just looking at the prosecutorial rate on the right-hand side, you'll see that there were about 9, 8, 8, and these are across the spectrum of all animals, not farmed animals. Having 9 successful prosecutions in a single year as compared to the mass industrialized cruelty that's happening on such a huge scale, you can start to see how this is a very ineffective way to get protection for these animals. So how do we do that then? Well, One of the things we've been looking at is the regulatory landscape. And as I mentioned, the Constitution is our supreme law, and that offers us a huge amount of opportunities to advocate for animals. So even though they are not mentioned in the Bill of Rights, or other than the Constitution to deal with the mandates of the departments to regulate them, the Constitution is the basis against which all actions must be tested, all laws, etc. So it's very much the supreme law. And we've been offered some opportunities to utilize the Constitution for animals, including farm animals. And I'm going to give 4 examples quickly before I show how we've done this. The first is that we have very robust constitutional rights, ranging from the right to environment, the right to food and water, information, freedom of expression, just administration, freedom from violence. Okay, so we have this existence of these rights. Then we have progressive interpretations of these rights by our courts, insofar as they don't only apply to human animals, but they actually apply to non-human animals too. So, for example, the right to environment has been interpreted by the Constitutional Court, which is the highest court, to include animals, saying that human rights and animal welfare are fundamentally interconnected, and that animals are sentient beings with intrinsic value as individuals. Another case has shown that the right to freedom of expression, the human right, has given activists a means to express cruelty, and that it shows that the public has a right to be informed of the humane or inhumane treatment of animals, right? So those two are just one of a few examples where the courts have applied these rights to animals. The third tool we have is that the Constitution does not only apply vertically as between government and its citizens, it also applies horizontally, which means that it binds juristic persons or corporations. So we have now mechanisms to hold corporations accountable instead of just holding government accountable. And that is something that doesn't appear in all other constitutions around the world. The final tool we have is that we have progressive enabling legislation for our rights. So you'll see a couple examples of environmental law relating to waste, air quality, water, etc. As we know, industrial animal agriculture affects all of those things. And then in other context of other rights, we have consumer rights, company law, food health and safety, transparency. Okay, so I'm going through this quickly, but I'm trying to show that there are progressive laws that we can use for animals that don't rely on us having using the animal cruelty statutes we have. So how have we utilized that? I'm going to give just 3 examples very quickly of some of the work we've done. But we use various other tools as well. So the first was for chickens in South Africa, where we looked at the egg industry, and we used our right to information to get information and documentation from those operating in the egg industry about animal welfare and their practices. And we used our right to environment, which incorporates animal welfare as interpreted by the courts. And then we used our freedom of expression and published this report in the public domain, where we rated these stakeholders. And we also provided research to give the public an idea, because public education is very important across not only animal welfare, but how it implicated their various other rights that they have. And we published this on Women's Month in South Africa, because egg-laying hens are women and have their reproductive systems exploited in the interests of this industry. And that's just an example of a snapshot of how we rated the companies that we had chosen. You might see some names you recognize, some of them are multinationals, and then some of the categories that we used to rank them across. And I can provide the links if people are interested. The second one is where we assisted members of the public with a complaint against a dairy company for using the words humane, happy cows, and presenting as if dairy was environmentally friendly. So they laid a complaint with the Advertising Regulatory Board. It was dismissed originally, and we as Animal Law Reform South Africa assisted them with their appeal. And ultimately, the appeals found that the humane treatment of animals includes more than freedom from violence. And in the context of dairy, right, cows cannot be described to be happy or humane because they lack tenderness, compassion, and sympathy. So that was an excellent ruling, and the dairy company had to remove the use of those terms from its advertising, happy cows and humane. The final one I want to touch on is a food systems reform project we took in 2022, where we really did extensive research into how to get people to shift away from animal-sourced foods towards alternatives, including plant-based and cell-based foods, including a public survey where we used all the information, gathered it into the barriers as to what is holding people back from doing this. You'll see 9 of them there. and then how we can build against those barriers towards a more just and inclusive food system, right? To include not only human, but animal interests too. So those were quite extensive reports that we've done in those two things, and they're all available on the website animallawreform.org. And I encourage you, if you're interested, to read them. They are very extensive, but they're very helpful at understanding the framework. And just in closing, I think there's a lot of opportunities for us to use the law and to use policy. There's increasing awareness among the public of these issues. There's a lot more collaboration happening in South Africa among the animal protection sector. We've got a lot more collaboration in terms of networks and alliances, and even a new plant-based foods association that's coming up. There's a new animal welfare bill, which is an overhaul of the current animal protection regime. So there's opportunities to try and put progressive stuff forward now in front of government before they pass it. The about seizure of meat products, there was a decision prohibiting that recently. And there's various opportunities to use strategic litigation against the context of those 4 categories I mentioned of the Constitution. But it's important that all efforts in this context are inclusive and context sensitive, right? And we need to consider that entire context in which we work before we put forward reforms. And also excitingly, there's a lot more animal work happening in the context of law, and we have some animal law courses too. So we're empowering a whole new generation of lawyers to take on this exciting work for animals and farmed animals too. So I'm going to stop there, and thank you very much for your time and attention, and look forward to the roundtable. Thanks.
Thank you, Amy. Next is Lorna Munoz. Lorna is an attorney based in Bolivia. She holds a Bachelor of Science in Cynology and a master's degree in Commerce and International Relations. Lorna also holds an LL.M degree in animal law from Lewis and Clark Law School in Portland, Oregon. She is currently working independently, focusing on her work as a dog rescuer, a non-human animal rights activist, a grassroots lobbyist, and she oversees various legal cases related to animal law in her home country, Bolivia. Welcome, Lorna. Lorna, you're muted.
Now is it okay?
Yep, I hear you. Go ahead and put up your presentation.
Okay. Yeah, let me know if it's patchy or something.
Yep, will do. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So I want to thank the Animal Law Commission Working Group of the International Association of Lawyers, and especially Jamie, who organized this event, for inviting me to present in this webinar. In order to understand the reality of farm animals in Bolivia, I will start by providing a glimpse into the country, its geography, and the farm animals that inhabit it. I don't know if you're seeing the slide, the second slide, Jamie, if you could
Yep, we
confirm.
see it. Go ahead and hit play so you
Okay.
can maximize the screen.
Okay. So as I mentioned, first I'm going to give a glimpse into Bolivia. Then I will mention some challenges in the country which affect farm animals directly. Next, I will explain the Bolivian legal system, the definition of farm animals in the country, and I will list all laws that could affect their interests. Here, I will also bring up some important questions to start a discussion about the protection of these laws offer farm animals, and some important aspects to take into account when developing new laws to protect farm animals in Bolivia. Finally, I will provide my conclusions and recommendations in order to improve their legal situation in the country. So farm animals in Bolivia. It's important to know that Bolivia is a landlocked country in the It's the 5th largest country in Latin America. Its geography is very diverse with 3 distinct geographic regions: the Altiplano, the valleys, and the plains. I'll just take a minute to cut my camera, please, because I think it's a little bit patchy. If you could give me a minute. Okay, I don't know if it's better, Jamie, now, if you can listen to me better.
Yep, we can hear you better. Go ahead and hit play and
Okay.
maximize the screen. Sounds good.
Yeah. I'm sorry, my internet is just, yeah. Okay. The valleys and the plains. According to the Bolivian government, Bolivia is amongst the 15 countries with the richest biodiversity in the world. It is estimated that Bolivia is home to around 402 species of mammals, 1,419 bird species, 259 species of amphibians, 308 reptile species, and 652 species of fish. Many of these species could be deemed to be farm animals. The Bolivian Altiplano is home to a large diversity of members of the camel family, such as the llama, the alpaca, the guanaco, vicuña. The highlands are also home to various rodents, such as the chinchilla, the vizcacha, the mara, and the cuy. The valleys, which are the most productive lands in the country, are home to various traditional farm animals such as ducks, geese, chicken, turkeys, ostriches, quails, fish, bees, butterflies, pigs, cows, bulls, goats, sheep, rabbits, horses, and donkeys. Along the plains, there are many reptile and fish species that are also used as farm animals. So we're going to start with the challenges in the country which affect farm animals directly. Bolivia sadly ranks at the bottom or near it amongst other Latin American countries when it comes to health, education, access to justice, and economic development. Due to these problems, the protection of animals, and especially farm animals, is one of the government's lowest priorities when developing their policies and laws in the country. The number of farm animals in the country and their living conditions are mostly uncertain. There is a large number of farm animals that are used for their fleece, especially llamas, alpacas, guanacos, and vicuñas, and their skin. Some others are used for transportation, but the majority of them are used for producing food. Bolivian society is only recently opening to vegetarian and vegan trends around the world. There are no official numbers, but it is estimated that around 0.5 to 1% of the population is vegetarian, and an even smaller percentage is vegan. The tendency in the last decades has been an increase in the consumption of animal-derived products in the country. For example, due to the high number of malnutrition cases in the country, especially in kids, the Bolivian government started a massive campaign to promote cow milk consumption around 13 years ago. The Bolivian Agency for Information informed in October of 2022 that the consumption of milk in the country increased in the past 11 years from 42 liters to 65 liters of milk per person per year. Thus, there has been a significant increase in the number of dairy farms in the country, and the existing dairy farms have expanded significantly. Similarly, there has been strong campaigning by poultry farmers to increase the consumption of eggs in the country. The latest data shows that there has been an important increase in the number of eggs eaten by Bolivians per year, which was 203. Poultry farmers want each Bolivian to increase this number to 1 egg per day. According to their data, in 2022, there were 520 poultry farms in the country, which housed around 14.5 million chicken, and the annual production of eggs in the country was around 2,700 million. According to a 2019 report, Bolivia has increased its consumption of chicken exponentially too. Prior to 2017, the country was in the 5th place amongst other Latin American countries when it came to chicken consumption. However, Bolivia had moved up to the 2nd place in the region by 2019, consuming around 43 kilograms of chicken per person per year. Nowadays, chicken is the most popular and most frequently consumed animal product in the country, mainly because it has a lower price and it's available to everyone. When it comes to beef consumption, the situation in the country is the same. In 1961, Bolivians used to consume 10 kilograms of beef per person per year. In 2020, the number had increased to 23 kilograms. The production of beef in 2022 reached 292,210 tons, 268,000 for internal consumption and 23,000 for export. So in the first 7 months of 2022, the country had already surpassed the value of all their beef export for the previous year, and it is only planned to keep increasing. Bolivia exports frozen meat and edible offal to many countries, such as Russia, China, Peru, and Ecuador, that have also steadily increased their demand for these products. As for pork, after a significant decrease in the production and consumption of this product during the pandemic, mainly due to many pork farms closing and the prices of product dropping more than 50%, a strong campaign to increase the sale levels of this product began in the last years. In the first trimester of 2023, there was an increase of 5.6% in the production compared to the same period in 2022, which is equivalent to 258,622 pigs slaughtered in this short period of time. The average consumption of pork in the country is around 5.5 and 6 kilograms per person per year. Since Bolivia is a landlocked country, the consumption of fish and seafood is amongst the lowest in the region, and fish farms in the country are not that numerous. In 2014, it was estimated that the average consumption of fish was 2 kilograms per person per year. However, a report published in 2018 mentioned that the import of fish from other countries, especially Argentina and Peru, had increased in 43%, which suggests that the internal consumption of these products is also increasing in the country. Because of the increased consumption of animal products that I already mentioned, what used to be small family-owned farms are now being replaced by factory farming, where the welfare of farm animals is consistently decreasing as these companies grow bigger and bigger to cope with internal and external demand for their products. Another problem that this increased consumption of animal products, especially beef, has caused is deforestation, which is rampant in Bolivia. The conversion of land to livestock pasture is one of the main issues contributing to deforestation in the country. In 2010, it was estimated that the deforestation rate was around 350,000 hectares per year, which is equivalent to 320 square meters per person per year, which is 20 times higher than the world's average deforestation rate and one of the highest deforestation rates in the world, even surpassing big developed countries' rates. It is estimated that this rate has only increased in the last years and now is closer to 400,000 hectares per year. There is also significant soil erosion from overgrazing and poor cultivation methods, including slash and burn agriculture. Recently, there have also been increased floods, drought, frost, heat, and other extreme weather events due to climate change, affecting many areas of the country, especially the high altiplano plateau, where a process of desertification has begun. These events affect small farms and families dedicated traditionally to raising farm animals. So now we're going to start talking about the laws. So Bolivia is a country with a civil law system influenced by Roman, Spanish, French, canon, religious, and indigenous law. One of Bolivia's law system main characteristics is the organization of its laws into systematic written laws, codes, and statutes, which are recognized as authoritative and ranked in a pre-established hierarchy. Therefore, case law is not that relevant in the country. There is no precise, unified, established definition or classification for animals in general in Bolivia. Therefore, the definition for farm animal does not exist in Bolivian laws. Most of the country's laws pertaining animals are aimed to protect wildlife. There are no national laws that deal with the protection of farm animals. There are some city laws dealing with farm animals, but mostly from a public health concern standpoint regarding their slaughter, not their welfare. Taking into account the laws hierarchy mentioned previously, the national laws that currently could be deemed to somehow affect farm animals are the political constitution of the state, which makes a differentiation between wild fauna and domestic animals. It establishes the government's duty to protect and take advantage of the country's natural resources and biodiversity, maintaining the environmental equilibrium. And it mentions that native animal species would be considered a natural patrimony of the country. Decree Law number 12760, Civil Code, which we could infer, which reading it, we could infer that animals would be considered some kind of property. This law mentions animals used in hunting and fishing, bee swarms, doves, rabbits, and fish as property that can be recovered by their rightful owner. Law number 1768, Criminal Code, which establishes that stealing some specific types of animals, such as horses, mules, donkeys, bovines, porcine, caprine, wool cattle, and branded cattle and purebred animals is a crime. It also establishes the crime of cruel treatment towards animals and the crime of biocide when killing an animal, which is linked to law number 700. Law number 700, it's the law for the defense of animals against acts of cruelty and mistreatment, establishes that animals are living beings and should be protected from acts of violence, cruelty, and mistreatment. It only applies to domestic animals, and sadly, animals used in conventional medicine and ancestral medicine and rites are excluded from its protection. Law number 71, which is Mother Earth Rights Law, establishes specific rights to which Mother Earth is entitled to. Then Law 300, which is the framework law of Mother Earth and integral development for living well, that is aimed to make the rights of Mother Earth set out in the law I previously mentioned, make them applicable, if you want, in the context of integral development for living well. So I mentioned various laws, but the question here for all of you, and I think to have a discussion, is could they really protect farm animals? We need to take into account that there's no explicit exclusion of farm animals in any of these laws, and there is no definition for farm animals in the country, as I mentioned previously. So I can see how valid arguments could be made for both sides to either exclude or include this category of animals from the protection of some of these laws. Some important questions to take into account are, could we assume that farm animals could be included in the category of domestic animals? Or are domestic animals more akin to companion animals? Does the concept of Mother Earth include farm animals? Or does Mother Earth only include wildlife? So I'm going to give you the definition in the law of Mother Earth right now. So Mother Earth, also known as Pachamama, is defined as the dynamic living system comprised by the indivisible community of all life systems and the interrelated, interdependent, and complementary living beings that share a common destiny. Mother Earth is considered sacred. It nurtures and it is the home that contains, sustains, and reproduces all living beings, ecosystems, biodiversity, organic societies, and the individuals that form it. Regardless of the result of this discussion and the fact that we decide farm animals are included or excluded from the protection of these laws, the next logical step in order to achieve a better protection for farm animals might seem to be developing new laws that ensure this protection. When developing these laws, we should take into account that all the facts that were mentioned before, such as the significant economic interests at play when it comes to dealing with farm animals, especially the ones who are used for food production in the country. The Bolivian government's interests when it comes to this subject and the fact that the protection of this category of animals might not garner enough attention in the political agenda of the country. And finally, we will have to analyze to what degree these laws could be deemed enforceable. All the laws protecting animals in Bolivia currently have serious enforceability issues in the judicial system due to different reasons. It is very difficult and costly for people to access a fair and timely process, which translates into rampant impunity when it comes to punishing crimes against animals. The established penalties for people that commit crimes against animals are very low. So very few people end up being detained, even in cases where the perpetrator was caught in the act. There is also a problem of all the groups of people that are excluded from being incarcerated due to some of the Bolivian criminal law's procedural rules. The very few that are convicted for these crimes end up only with house arrests most of the time due to jail and prison overcrowding. There is a lack of economic resources allocated to the branches dedicated to investigating and prosecuting this type of crimes too. There is also a lack of trained personnel in these departments. In general, the importance granted by the Bolivian society to prosecuting these crimes against animals is still secondary when compared to crimes against humans. Finally, there is also a very high degree of corruption within the judicial system and an alarmingly high dependency on the political power, which does not guarantee that justice is served in most of the cases. Additionally, when it comes to animal law as a specific subject, this area of the law is still very new and underdeveloped in Bolivia. In the last years, some theoretical discussions have started regarding some important subjects dealt with in countries that have more developed animal law knowledge. But the country is still far from tackling with some of the most important problems posed around the world regarding animals. Most of the efforts to bring animal law to the forefront in the country are led by individual animal protection activists. Case law on the subject is very difficult to find, with only a few scattered cases that make it through the judicial system. So, if Bolivia aims to effectively protect farm animals in the future, some profound changes should happen in the country. There are still many protection laws to be developed for this group of animals who are numerous and currently have no real legal protection in the country. Notwithstanding the creation of more farm animal protection laws, these laws must be matched with adequate enforcement mechanisms to be effective. Fair and timely judicial administrative processes must be guaranteed and easily accessed by the people. Penalties for violating these laws must be significant enough to make a difference. Sufficient economic resources must be allocated to departments in charge of investigating and prosecuting these violations, and more trained personnel must be placed in these departments. Additionally, when developing these laws, some aspects I consider must be taken into account to increase the chances of success due to Bolivia's reality when it comes to farm animals are. Bolivia is still a country where farm animals are culturally viewed differently than other categories of animals. Bolivia's economy is highly dependent on the exploitation of these animals, and they represent the largest category of animals in the country. Therefore, I consider that developing these protection laws from an abolitionist standpoint instead of a welfare standpoint will guarantee they fail even entering the country's political agenda. Since the reality is that we live in an anthropocentric country, I consider that people will be more open to having a discussion about farm animals protection if it is linked to a public health and even personal health concern point of view. Similarly, if the issue was linked to environmental concerns, the chances of success would increase. It is necessary to create factory farming industry standards that are measurable and enforceable. It would also be helpful to create local care standard boards in each city to oversee the compliance with these standards. Some common and cruel practices such as extreme confinement, force feeding, gestation crates, tail docking, teeth clipping, dehorning, battery cages, castration, debeaking, maceratus, thumping, cannibalism, and flame clipping should be banned. Alternatives to meet the high demand for animal products in the country should be promoted. Although Bolivia is very far behind in scientific development, alternatives such as laboratory-grown meat could be an interesting import for the country in order to reduce the quantity of farm animals who are used as food. Finally, the importance of humane education at every level cannot be ignored due to its importance in creating individuals who understand the need for compassion and respect for non-human animals, other people, the environment, and all living creatures. This type of education is still very rare in the country's educational system, which is another challenge to be faced in the future when improving Bolivia's farm animal law reality. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lorna. That was great. Hira Jaleel is a lawyer from Pakistan. She is currently a teaching fellow and adjunct professor at the Center for Animal Law Studies at Lewis and Clark Law School, where she teaches food law and aquatic animal law. Prior to joining Lewis and Clark, Hira practiced law in Lahore, Pakistan, where she litigated extensively to protect the interests of non-human animals and helped draft animal welfare legislation at the federal and provincial levels. Hira's research and scholarship focuses on international and comparative animal law issues, especially in Pakistan. Welcome, Hira.
Thank you so much for having me here, and thank you, Jamie, for organizing this webinar and putting it together. So I'm going to be talking about industrial animal agriculture in Pakistan, and I'm going to be kind of taking a more industry-focused approach. So I'm going to be going from industry to industry and then providing a holistic overview of the laws implicated and then what I see are as bottlenecks in protecting farmed animals in Pakistan. So to start off, I just want to situate Pakistan on the world map. For those of you who might not know where it is, there's a common misconception that Pakistan is actually in the Middle East, when it is in fact a South Asian country bordering India, China, Iran, Afghanistan. Pakistan is a very, very populous country. Our population right now is approximately 231 million people. It is also a very religious country. So the official state religion of the country is Islam, and 97% of the population is Muslim, which of course then has implications for farmed animals in terms of which farmed animals are, who is farmed, who is consumed for food, and what issues arise in farmed animal protection in the country. Also, I think one important thing, again, to situate Pakistan and Pakistan's kind of cultural context is to emphasize on the fact that 37% of the population lives in poverty. It is a very gender unequal country. I'm glad that Lorna and Amy also brought this up in their presentations, because these things obviously make a difference when you're advocating for animals. And I think they also impact how you advocate for animals, whether you do it through legislation, litigation, or advocacy. So talking about industrial animal agriculture specifically, in Pakistan, the agricultural economy is generally a mix of crops and livestock farming, but animal agriculture makes up about 56% of Pakistan's agricultural production and contributes 12% to the total GDP of the country. Commonly farmed animals include cows, buffaloes, goats, sheep, chicken, and camels. And one commonly farmed animal you might notice conspicuously missing from this list is pigs. And that's because, going back to the fact that Pakistan is a predominantly Muslim majority country, pigs, the consumption of pork is considered haram, which is, in other words, illegal under Islamic law. And so pigs are actually, in my mind, I think this is a good thing that pigs are kind of spared from being subjected to farming in the country. And so pork is not a commonly consumed kind of food product. Though I do want to kind of say that in recent years, China has been investing more and more in Pakistan, and we now have an influx of Chinese workers who are living in Pakistan, and there's kind of this cultural blend happening. And it would be interesting to see if the makeup of animals farmed in Pakistan changes in the future based on the fact that there's more and more Chinese influence in the country. So this is just a snapshot of the commonly farmed animals in terms of numbers. This is my cat, Feisty, who has decided to take over the webinar and make a guest appearance. Okay, so as you can see that goats are in fact also very, very commonly farmed. And in fact, mutton, which is the flesh of goats, is very commonly consumed in the country. So now talking industry-wise, starting with dairy. So Pakistan is actually the fourth largest milk producer globally after the US, China, and India. And the sector has a $10 billion market size, right? However, interestingly, despite the fact that Pakistan produces so much dairy and milk, 80% of the dairy production and distribution is still concentrated in the hands of small backyard farms and vendors who I would define as, individuals who own maybe 2 to 3, maybe 5 animals each. And only 5% of this of this production is concentrated in the hands of big dairy corporations, also known as mega dairies, defined by factory farming operations where each farm has more than 500 cows. And then 15% comes from national dairy commercial companies, so where the government has nationalized, has taken over dairy, and the government is kind of acting through corporations to produce milk. And we see, just kind of as Lorna also pointed out in her, and Amy also pointed out in her presentation, there is a global shift, I think, around the world where global majority or global South countries are now adopting these factory farming methods that have historically kind of been that we attribute to global North countries. And we see a similar trend in Pakistan. So there's a slow shift. It's slow, but it's happening from small to big dairy, right? To try and concentrate dairy production in the hands of these mega dairies that currently make up only 5% of dairy production. And there's different, and the law is actually being used as an instrument to bring about this change, right? So there's like a concerted campaign against small dairy on food safety grounds, on the grounds that, because right now what happens is that a lot of people in Pakistan still get loose milk, right? Which is basically a milkman is going to come to their house to deliver milk. That milk is often going to be unpasteurized, it's not going to be processed, and is going to be just delivered in like these loose bags, right? It's called loose milk. And so there's lots of advertisements, there's lots of campaigning against purchasing such milk, mostly on food safety grounds. And there's also legislation to actively try and ban the sale of loose milk. So the Punjab, which is a province of Pakistan that I'm from, in 2018 passed pure food regulations under the Food Safety Act, which banned the sale of loose milk and required all milk producers and sellers to register with the government, and imposed specific requirements for technology requirements in order to produce milk, which of course disproportionately affected small farmers and small farms. And what's interesting in this kind of context is that attempts to ban the sale of fresh or loose milk and to evict small farmers from cities, which is also something that the government has previously tried to do, usually gets challenged before the court in litigation, and courts usually do end up siding with the small farmers in these cases. And so far, because of the judiciary kind of actively stepping in, these mega dairies have been unsuccessful in really taking over a larger share of milk production in the country. But of course, I think that it's only inevitable that factory farming in this industry is just going to intensify over time. Talking about beef or mutton or cattle and goats, there is a lot of crossbreeding happening in the country and lots of importing of cows from abroad, right? Which basically means that a lot of indigenous cow breeds who are resilient to Pakistan's really, really hot temperatures, who are resilient to disease, are basically being wiped out in favor of these high meat and milk producing cow breeds that are being imported. Then meat production is on the rise in Pakistan as well as is in most parts of the world. Every year it rises. It rose to 3.873 million tons in 2016 compared to 3.696 in 2015. Exports of red meat are also growing at a pretty high rate of 30% every year. And again, because Pakistan is a Muslim majority country and just globally around the world, there is a demand for halal meat, and ostensibly all meat produced in Pakistan is supposed to be halal. The government is actively trying to establish halal meat export or strengthen the halal meat export industry by giving tax breaks on installation of halal meat and processing facilities, and actively sponsoring and subsidizing meat processing plants so that more halal meat can be exported to countries abroad. And in March 21, kind of example of this is in March 2022, the federal government proposed a new livestock policy, which aimed to increase the exports of halal milk, meat, butter, and other products. This is also interesting from the perspective that there is no such thing as halal milk, right? Halal is basically has to do with how an animal is raised and slaughtered. And so milk and butter and these products actually can't even be halal. So it's a marketing tactic, essentially. This policy supports modern organic livestock farming to boost the number of farmed animals. These terms are not defined, which is why I put them in quotation marks. Nobody knows what this means. And it proposes the establishment of model meat production farms, which is just a fancy way of saying intensifying factory farming and concentrated farming operations. Moving to the poultry sector, this is one sector in Pakistan that's already very entrenched and established. In the 1970s, the government heavily subsidized the sector, gave tax breaks that led to a 20 to 30% growth per annum in this industry, which led to Pakistan currently being the 8th largest poultry producer in the world. Poultry accounts for about a third of all meat that's consumed in the country, and is a sector that's still booming and growing rapidly every year. The figures that I've come across in Pakistan measure chicken meat in tons as opposed to the number of animals farmed, which is interesting because that's usually the case for aquatic animals, but in this case, it's also the case for chickens. And there's about 15,000 farms right now, each having about 5,000 to 500,000 chicken. So if you want to calculate the number of chickens, you can kind of do that. I'm really bad at math. This is just a snapshot from the website of the Pakistan Poultry Association that kind of shows the kind of marketing that's going around poultry production and poultry consumption. The idea is, poultry is the perfect form of protein, and if you don't consume chicken and eggs every day, your children are going to be deficient. You're going to be deficient. You're not going to get proper nutrition. And I think most of us are familiar with these sorts of arguments, but the poultry industry is really heavily pushing this in Pakistan, and they're backed by the government, and they're backed by they don't actually have a lot of opposition to this messaging. And so quickly coming to legislation, Pakistan actually has lots of laws. So Pakistan, I wouldn't say, is a country that doesn't have legislation. In fact, its scholars and advocates in Pakistan have argued that in some ways it's an overly legislated country. There's lots of laws that deal with animal health, that deal with animal breeding, production, slaughter. However, I wouldn't say that those are farmed animal protection laws, because they actually just don't address protection. Protection actually is addressed under anti-cruelty laws, which apply to actually not specifically farmed animals, but captured and domestic animals. So farmed animals technically fall under both of those categories. But however, of course, as is in the case of the other jurisdictions that other panelists have identified, there's little to no enforcement of anti-cruelty laws. And for laws that deal with farmed animals specifically, of course, if there's a focus on animal health, there will be a focus on a requirement to feed the animals, to provide them water, but they don't address their conditions of confinement as such, or their welfare as such. Also, there are slaughter laws that prohibit the slaughter of useful animals, and the term is actually defined under the law as animals who are pregnant, are lactating, or are very, very young. But I think the term useful animal shows you the approach the law is taking to these animals. The reason you're not supposed to slaughter them is because they still have some use other than their meat or their flesh. So don't slaughter them while they're still useful, but you're free to slaughter them later on when they're ceased to be useful to humans, essentially. And to talk about advocacy, there's actually very few NGOs in Pakistan actually working to protect farmed animals, especially from like these efforts to intensify industrial animal agriculture in the country. And actually, in this case, the biggest champions of the animals might just be the small farmers who are resisting these corporations from stepping in and intensifying farming operations. There is work to update. Pakistan's anti-cruelty legislation is very, very old. It's from when Pakistan was still a British colony in 1890. And the government is actively looking to update the legislation, but it's very unlikely that it'll either cover farmed animals or be used to protect farmed animals, even if the law is updated and new laws are enacted, just because you see of all these other policies that are actively seeking to intensify animal agriculture and to increase exports of animal meat. As well as there's a domestic push to increase meat consumption. So it's not just about exports, it's also about meat consumption being a sign of social and economic mobility in the country. There's cultural connotations attached to it, there's religious connotations attached to it. And so it's not just about what the government wants and what the legislature is saying, but also what people themselves want. They see consuming more meat and consuming more animal flesh as a sign of wealth and status. And that kind of messaging or that kind of thinking is something that needs to be addressed separately. And so what would I say Pakistan kind of needs to do, or some of the things that I've identified as potential solutions or ways, directions in which we can move? Firstly, we need to engage with religious arguments because it's such a predominantly Muslim and religious country. Religion plays a big role, and every time you try to advocate for farmed animals, a common pushback you're likely to get is that it's anti-Islam to be vegetarian. It's because if Islam has allowed us to consume animal flesh, we can't suddenly say, no, we're not going to. We can't go against God and make that choice, right? And so if you can't approach it from a secular perspective, you need to engage with Islamic arguments that protect farmed animals. Secondly, there really aren't any, because there's very few organizations working on advocacy, we really don't have this model that we have, for example, in the US, where there's undercover investigations and there's a lot of transparency in some ways on what goes on behind the scenes, right? There are people actively working to make that happen. That's not the case in Pakistan. Consumers really don't know what's happening behind the scenes in like these mega dairies or in poultry farms. There's also a need to position a plant-based or plant-forward lifestyle in a culturally appropriate way that doesn't just seem like the imposition of a Western concept onto a global South country, because that is likely to, just because of Pakistan's history, we were colonized for a very long time. We've only been independent since 1947. There is a lot of pushback that one gets if you try to ask people to go vegan, because the term veganism is associated with the very kind of Western lifestyle. And of course, there's a need, I think, in every country for grassroots advocacy and capacity building, because when advocates are trying to make change from within, I've generally seen that that's more readily accepted than when change is being imposed from top down or from even outside the country. So that's my presentation, and I'm looking forward to the roundtable. Thank you.
Thank you, Hira. Thanks, everyone, for your great presentations today. So we're going to start the roundtable segment, and we're just going to go around and ask some questions, give the panelists some opportunity to talk with each other. My first question is actually for Amy. So Amy, one of your slides actually showed an advertisement from Nando's Peri Peri. It is a chicken restaurant, kind of like a fast food restaurant that we also have here in the United States. So that ad, it objectified both chicken and women at the same time. It was quite shocking, and it highlights the links between different types of systematic oppressions that our world is dealing with right now. And I was wondering, if you had any insights into how the animal welfare and rights movement could work together with other groups and organizations to fight systematic oppressions together.
Yeah, thanks so much. And I agree that the advert was very shocking. I think it's important that in the context of South Africa, animal protection is understood as an issue of social justice. Obviously, it is oppression, it's systematic oppression of vulnerable beings. And I think that the messaging of the movement needs to very much be centered around that and recognizing these interconnected oppressions. So some of the work we have been doing is working with environmental protection organizations and working with human rights organizations across the spectrum, including for the protection of workers and those working on gender issues, to try and kind of get them on board to understand that these issues are all intersecting and interrelated. So, for example, some of the work, and I know it's been happening in the US context, where domestic violence and domestic protection laws are being expanded to include companion animals as part of the family. So there's been some excellent work done, one of the thesis by Dr. Sheena Swemmer, under the supervision of Professor David Bultitz, who's part of our organization, on expanding domestic violence protection laws to include animals. So obviously that's in the context of companion animals, but laying those foundations and trying to get government, the legislature, and even people within the gender protection movement to understand, right, the importance of those intersections and how it actually does impact on other vulnerable populations, whether it's women, the elderly, or children. So I think a lot of it comes down to first trying to get people to understand how those oppressions are connected with one another, how those manifest in our society, and then how we can use existing laws to expand protection to animals. So it's kind of a sensitization process that first needs to happen, and one of the barriers to that is getting information on these issues. So even in Dr. Swemmer's thesis, just getting statistical information about animal abuse and animals abused in the home is extremely challenging. So I think that work is slowly starting to happen a lot more. And the Nando's advert that I showed you, there's another lady called Carla Tampiras, who's done a whole thing called Hot Chicks, where she's actually compared various adverts in the meat industry in South Africa, particularly Nando's. It seems to be a thing that they do quite often to show again those intersections. So it is happening. It's very important. And I think looking at animal protection through the lens of social justice is critical for advancing animal law in the country. In a nutshell.
Me too. That's great. Thank you for that answer. That was great. So my next question is actually for Lorna. You were talking about farmed animals and how they lack any sort of legal definition in Bolivia. And so they could potentially fall on under laws, and they could be companion animals. They could, we could mess with the definitions there and argue either way. So do you lean towards the inclusion or exclusion of farmed animals in the existing laws that you have? What is your opinion on that?
I think it's a little bit risky to include them in these laws because, like, as I mentioned, like case law is not that important to Bolivia. So if it's not written in the law, and it would depend on the interpretation, as I said, I have arguments pro and against including them. I think that maybe specific animals could be included as companion animals, even if they're farm animals. But as a group, as a whole, I think it's going to be quite difficult to argument that. I would lean, for example, Mother Earth law. If you read the definition in the law, I could argue that they could be more included into that law than the other one, because it's pretty clear, like every living creature. So maybe I think they could be more included into Mother Earth law than the other one, the companion animal law, only specific cases. So that's my opinion, but I think it's still risky. I think more specific law should be developed to guarantee that they're protected.
Yeah, that's a great answer. I mean, when it comes down to, the type of law and how law is practiced in Bolivia, not being able to include case law, it's hard to make any progress in that way. So legislation is definitely needed, but I agree with you. Mother Earth law, it seems like it would fall easily under that based on those definitions included there. Hira, I have a question for you. One of the things that I was wondering about is fish. You teach a class here about aquatic animal law. And so I kind of want to know what the state of that is in Pakistan. Or is fish farming a thing there? Is it becoming a thing there? What's happening with that?
Yeah, no, I think it's very important when we talk about farmed animals to include aquatic animals because, like I mentioned in my presentation as well, that they're not even measured in the number of individuals, they're measured in their weight in tons. So we're talking about trillions of individuals there. In Pakistan, I think like much of the rest of the world, again, yes, there is a lot of, because Pakistan, the southern province of Pakistan is next to the coast, actually the southern two provinces. And so marine production so over the last 10 years, marine production has increased tenfold and aquaculture production has increased more than 20-fold, right? So we're really seeing this sector expand rapidly to the point that in 2018, the federal government issued a deep sea fishing policy and noted that because before 2018, and this is quite sad that before 2018, like the use of trawlers in fishing was in deep sea fishing was not banned. And because of that, many fish populations collapsed in Pakistan's exclusive economic zone. And it was only in 2018 that the government actually banned trawlers and said that, other types of fishing obviously requires licenses. However, this isn't being effectively implemented or enforced. So in 2020, there's been news reports from 2020 that Chinese trawlers are still fishing in Pakistan's exclusive economic zone, which is also, again, which is why I'm so interested in also examining this impact of Chinese investment in Pakistan and how that's impacting animals as well. In 2019, the government decided to allocate about 13.7 billion rupees, which is approximately $87 million for 3 aquaculture development projects that related to shrimp and trout farming. And so we're seeing aquaculture also kind of grow as an industry because, again, it's the government that's really focusing on it and subsidizing it and allocating a big chunk of a lot of money, actually, because Pakistan's economy is really bad. And despite that, the government is actively focusing on enhancing and subsidizing this industry. So it's quite concerning. And I think that's also something that we need to keep an eye on as animal lawyers.
That's really a negative development. I'm sorry to hear about that. So let's just open it up so that you can all talk with each other and ask questions with each other.
I have a question for Amy. I know you mentioned in your presentation that you have been using other laws, not specific animal protection laws, to protect farm animals. So I was curious if you could give us an example of one case, like a case where you could use positively these laws to protect these animals, because it's kind of like what we were talking about in Bolivia.
Great. Yeah, thanks so much for the question. I think because of the problems with the current animal framework, one of the opportunities I see really, other than obviously kind of constitutional rights, is something like the Consumer Protection Act. So we have a really robust Consumer Protection Act, and this is largely based on, again, some of the problems that were happening during apartheid, with food apartheid as well, where people were misled about their food and the kind of food injustice and things like that. So because of that, we have this excellent law from 2008, but up to this point, it hasn't really been properly utilized in the context of farmed animals. And as we know from around the world, there's a lot of humane washing and a lot of greenwashing practices, and that's also very prevalent in the South African context. So I did mention briefly that dairy advertising case. That wasn't in the courts per se, that was through the Advertising Regulatory Board and the appeals committee there. But along similar lines, just based also off of how their response was to that case, I really believe that utilizing those consumer protection laws against those practices, particularly where they are very obvious, right, where it's very misleading to consumers, and we actually are able to trace back the circumstances of those particular animals used along their supply chain, I really do see consumer protection law as a very good avenue. Another one, of course, is environmental law, which up to this point has not also been properly utilized, but similarly, we have fantastic environmental laws, and just making those links with industrialized animal agriculture and, for example, climate change, etc. We have a new climate change bill that's coming out, which doesn't properly or adequately address industrial animal agriculture. So I really see a huge opportunity to use laws across the spectrum, but I think those two for me stand out immediately.
I have a question for you, Lorna. You've mentioned, of course, the Mother Earth rights law, and also I know that generally in a lot of Latin American countries, this framework, the rights of nature framework, is really being used to make some excellent advances for animals. So, what's the status of using this rights of nature kind of framework in Bolivia, and has it been used to protect farmed animals specifically?
So far, it hasn't been used in any case, but I can tell you that Mother Earth law is not being used at all, not even for wildlife. That's why I was like asking the question, like if it would be more akin to protecting wildlife, which seems to be the interpretation in Latin America and everything. They don't include companion animals and they don't include farm animals, sadly, in these nature protection laws. And it's more, I know, I think it's interpreted to be wildlife. But in Bolivia, sadly, as I mentioned, we have many enforceability issues. And with the political reality, it is very sad. Like this law, I have a lot of criticism to this law too. Like if anyone saw my presentations regarding specifically Mother Earth law, is I think it's just, I don't know, it's just lip service, because sadly, there is no protection ombudsman, which was supposed to be created 10 years ago. It's not created yet. There is no allocation of economic resources to the department that should be making this law. People obey this law, and the government right now is the one that is destroying nature with mining activities. We have Chinese companies coming into the country, so it's really bad. So no case, for example, now based on this law, I think would have a good outcome, because the judicial system is managed by the government totally, 100% right now. There's no independence. So I don't see how they're gonna go against their interests and their projects. So sadly, I don't see an application for this law. Maybe if the government changes and, like I said, we lobby more and there's like more people that are educated, humane education, and we go into this law and we start demanding that this law, I don't know, I think maybe there's a future, but as the situation, the political situation, economic situation is right now, I don't see that this law could be applied to protect any animal or nature.
Okay, that's very depressing. I'll shift then and I'll ask Hira a question. One of the things you mentioned in your presentation was kind of the lack of undercover investigations. And I'm just curious if there's a similar kind of system as there is in the US with these ag-gag laws that maybe prohibit people from going into those facilities, or is there maybe another reason that people aren't doing them?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and one that I've thought about a lot as well. Why there's no undercover investigations and why aren't activists focusing more on farmed animals? And from talking to activists, I think a couple of reasons emerge. Firstly, it doesn't have anything to do with legislation or the law. There aren't any such things as ag-gag laws, because I think even in the US, ag-gag laws have been a response to undercover investigations and trying to prohibit them. So like that needs to start first in order for the legislature to respond to it negatively. It's just not happening in Pakistan for anyone to take notice. And I think the reason is mainly also religious. So a lot of the activists I've spoken to, they say that they themselves are very religious and is Muslim, and so they think that asking people to not consume animal flesh is just akin to that argument of like, oh, you're asking them to go against what God has said, and it can be very controversial. And in Pakistan, actually, religious minorities, Pakistan has I'm so sorry, it's feisty lying on your laptop.
I think we enjoy the interruption.
Yeah, she's right here. But yeah, so sorry, what was I saying? Okay. No, yeah, so yeah, the religious argument, right? And so Pakistan has this history of like religious minority persecution as well. And so people just don't want to touch anything that has anything to do with religion or try and make, arguments that are religious in nature. And the second, I think, thing also is that the movement itself in Pakistan is very young. So their activists are so bogged down by trying to protect street dogs, captive wild animals in zoos, and all of these other, there's just so like working equines. And so there's just so many animals who are being treated so horribly that I think it's just like activists just can't, focus on farmed animals. They haven't overcome all of these other, I think, gateway issues, I guess, that you could kind of call them, that other countries kind of tackle with before they get to farmed animals. In Pakistan, even these other issues are just so big, and the legislation is so poor that I think it's just there isn't a lot of focus on farmed animals also for this reason.
That's really unfortunate. Well, maybe we need to do some investigations so Pakistan can start thinking about ag gag laws, and then we can defeat those. So I have a question for Amy. I don't know if you touched on this or not actually in your presentation, but in the last couple of years, there's been a lot of news coming out of South Africa about the controversy surrounding live export. So for those that don't know about it, oftentimes these animals, they're farmed animals, oftentimes sheep or cattle, are loaded onto boats, large vessels that don't have any climate control, and then they endure long journeys, often packed into tight quarters where there may be food and water, but the animals are so squished in there that they can't reach it. Many die and many suffer on the way. Has there been any government action on this issue, or where does that stand right now in South Africa?
Yeah, thanks. And it definitely is something that's been in the public domain quite a lot. And I think I will also just want to point out quickly that one of the reasons why live export has become an issue, because it isn't traditionally been such a big matter, is because a lot of other countries have been implementing bans, which is obviously very exciting for them and great work by the activists. But again, it's an example where we see another shift in industry, right? Because South Africa didn't have proper regulation. There was this opportunity for the live export companies to come in and start this practice. So for a long time, it wasn't regulated at all. And there was actually quite a lot of, or quite a few court cases trying to challenge the practice by the NSPCA, and this was predominantly done trying to use the Animals Protection Act, but it wasn't successful for various reasons. And one of the issues with live export is because of the extraterritoriality of the application of the act, right? Because once they leave the waters, they're out of that context. So they were trying to kind of narrow focus what was happening when they were still there with loading and things like that. But many of them were unsuccessful, though they did have one case where they were able to halt one of the shipments for a short time. But essentially the response by government to these cases, because they realized there was a lot of backlash in the public and in the courts, was to implement these guidelines, which came into effect March of this year, I believe. But the problem with them is that they're guidelines and nobody quite understands what legal authority they have, because they're not in the form of like regulations. And also the person who made the guidelines, there's some discussion around whether there's authority of that person to even make these things. So in terms of what they are, they try to regulate aspects such as animal welfare, etc. But again, there's a lot of confusion about the efficacy of them. And although there was a break in the live export practice, it seems like now this gap has been filled, and actually very recently there was another shipment despite there being this kind of like moratorium for a period. So it's very much a hot topic that we're still trying to figure out how best to intervene in it, but government has now made these guidelines, so we're still in the midst of trying to figure out what to do with them. So maybe watch this space, I guess.
Maybe some test cases. Maybe you need to get some law clerks to help you with some test cases to see, to push the boundaries on that.
Send them our way.
Hira, I have a question for you. Have there been any cases about farmed animals in Pakistan?
Yeah, well, no, there haven't. No farmed animal specific case law that I've kind of come across. There have been, so for example, one of the anti-cruelty laws that I didn't really go into detail is just the general criminal code, which criminalizes, hurting or abusing or mutilating owned animals of a certain value. So it does actually address a lot of livestock and farmed animals. But the idea is, because they have property value to someone. And what ends up happening in Pakistan is, because we have so many individual small farmers, people will often, they'll get into fights with other farmers, will get into fights with other farmers and harm their animals as a way of like harming them. And so the idea is that like this is meant to kind of criminalize that practice and to protect the farmer's property interests. So we have some prosecution under that in that framework. And the facts of those cases are almost always like, someone had a fight with someone or had beef, pun intended, or like, I don't know if this is the appropriate word, but like had a fight with someone and hurt their animal. And so, a cruelty prosecution in that case. But there hasn't really been, because of course, like Pakistan has strategic impact litigation or public interest litigation that has generally been deployed to protect captive wild animals, to protect street dogs, to defend restrictions on hunting, for example. But even those, that kind of litigation really hasn't happened in the farmed animal context. Though I will say that I was the petitioner in a case where we filed a petition to regulate live animal markets, which also includes markets where farmed animals are being sold on the basis of like zoonotic disease outbreak and public health grounds. That petition is still pending. So we only had one hearing in that case where we got past the standing stage. So it hasn't been heard on merits yet, but that's kind of one avenue, I guess, where we can kind of fold in, because of course that also covers pet shops, that also covers wild animal markets. So farmed animals can kind of also be beneficiaries, if there's a positive outcome in that litigation, can be beneficiaries of that decision by virtue of the fact that they're also exhibited in live animal markets.
Yeah, public health and safety issues can really create inroads for some of our concerns. So that is a really great idea. And I look forward to hearing what happens with that petition. Lorna, you had mentioned that there aren't any official statistics, but less than 1% of Bolivians are believed to be vegetarian, and there's no data on veganism. Have you seen any types of organized vegan movements in Bolivia at this point?
Not really. As I mentioned, like protection for farm animals is mostly it comes from individuals, like animal protection individuals. You can see it in social media, especially Facebook, which is very used like here in Bolivia. So you see some animal activists like kind of known in the country or in each city advocating for veganism and vegetarian things. There is no organized movement like to promote veganism and vegetarianism. So I have seen an increase in, for example, restaurants that offer vegetarian, especially food. There's one that opened last week, for example, here in the city. But we're talking about the 3 main cities in Bolivia, like the biggest ones. Because if you go to smaller populations, like this is foreign, absolutely foreign subject, you cannot talk about it. It's not going to be even considered. So these are the biggest cities that have influences from United States, Europe, and other like influences. So I think it's increasing, and people are starting to take farm animals into account more, but it's still very reduced. And as I mentioned, it's a cultural thing. Like farm animals are considered like the last of animals to take into account. Their food, they're used for other things, transportation and everything. So it's quite difficult to get people to understand that there are alternatives and everything. That's why I personally advocate for replacing these products with some alternatives like lab-grown meat. I can see how people would consume that type of product. It would be more easy to do that, replace this meat with lab-grown meat, than turning everyone into vegan or vegetarian tendency. So that's why I'm hopeful for these things. Like I said, Bolivia is not a big country in science, but I think it could be a good input. And since it's not that big of a population and compared to numbers you provided, Amy, especially from animals, it looks like a small number here, like it's relatively small. So I think like maybe we could be a country for making an experiment on replacing. So I think it could be interesting to choose small populations and do like this. And yeah, and humane education, as I said, I think it's very important to start in schools all up to universities and everything, because I think there is not that culture. And I think if we start doing that, it's going to improve, like the situation is going to improve, and at least people will take these animals into account.
Yeah, humane education is key, no matter where you are. We need to do a lot more of that. Well, the UIA Animal Law Commission would like to thank the panelists today, each who are foremost experts in their fields. It has been an honor to have you participate in the discussion today. Thank you for your efforts to put together wonderful presentations for a great program. Also, thank you to our commission members and attendees today, and we hope that you've enjoyed this program. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.